In Orkney, we used to have an expression, "I'll be Ower with the moon," meaning that I would come and visit you when the moon is full to light my way. Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of Ower with the Moon. And this month we've got a visitor, although a virtual visitor rather than here in person, but has been here in person before. Delighted to introduce Nick Jubber, who some of you may know from his books. Fascinating writer, wonderful, and we will talk more about how great he is later, which might embarrass you, but I don't care. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks very much for inviting me on. It's lovely to be chatting virtually with you.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed our blether a couple of years ago when you were researching for your new upcoming book, which we will talk about later. But while you were here, and this was talking about storytelling and stories and such like. But while you were here, you very generously gave me a copy of your book, The Fairy Tellers, which I highly recommend to anybody that's got even a passing interest in folk tales. This book is brilliant. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's subtitled A Journey into the Secret History of Fairy Tales by Nicholas Jubber, and it's an absolute gem of a book, looking at different collectors of folk tales, but also their sources, which is what tends to get airbrushed out of history, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was that attempt to try and look at the range of people who had contributed to fairy tales that was sort of part of what drove me into writing that book, to look at some of those collectors, but also the people who gave them the stories and whose names were often sort of omitted from the published editions. And in some cases, people who also came up with new fairy tales or came up with what became very definitive versions of tales.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the first person that you begin with is an Italian gentleman from the 17th century, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Giambattista Basile. Yeah, and he's an amazing character to read about and research about. I mean, I had an absolute ball just sort of delving into his life because he did so much and had such an adventurous life. One of his books actually is called I think it's The Adventurous Misadventure, and he in many ways sort of encapsulates his own life, and I think is partly autobiographical. But he did all kinds of things. He went off to Venice he was born near to Naples, went off to Venice, joined a fleet fighting against the Ottomans, got involved in all sorts of warmongering, which he didn't actually enjoy at all. And he wrote some wonderfully bitter satires about the sort of the terror of being a soldier and constantly worrying that you're going to get hit by various weaponry and artillery, but also end up in the hospital with a soldier's pension plan. And he eventually went back to Naples and to the area that he came from, and found out that his sister had become a hugely successful diva in the world of music, singing for the Dukes of Mantua with Monteverdi, the great classical composer, composing verses that she was singing at the time. But I think Giambattista was one of those people who could never really hold down a position anywhere for very long. So he worked in Mantua for a bit, and then he goes off to Avellino and to various other sort of city states around mainland Italy, before ending up in a little place under under Mount Vesuvius, rather unfortunately when it erupted, and he ended up catching a lung infection and dying. But left behind these amazing fairy tales that he'd collected and written down, and put very much his own stamp on them. They're very charismatically written and full of his own personal energy. They're not necessarily easy stories to retell to children in the words that he told them, but they're full of charm and vitality, and very much a sort of a particular energy of their time, of that sort of 17th century Italian brio that they've got in them.
I mean, they're quite kind of bawdy and well, earthy, I think, is probably the word.
Yes, there's some wonderful, and there's so many wonderful tales in them. I mean, just to pluck, one out of the air, there's the story of the cockroach, the mouse, and the cricket, which is one of my favourites, where there's lots of stories about a sort of Jack the lad who's a bit of a fool, but stumbles into a fortune in some way. And in this case, this lad gets thrown out of home because he's brought back this magical cockroach, mouse, and cricket, when his father was expecting him to bring back some money from the fair or from the market. And so he wanders around until he comes to a court where it turns out the cockroach, mouse, and cricket can sing and dance. And so they're very entertaining. And there's a bit of a trope in a lot of the Italian fairy tales of the princess who doesn't laugh. And if you can make her laugh, then you get to marry her and become the heir to the throne. And he does that. But then, because he's a bit of seen as a bit of a yokel from the sticks, the king has him through a bit of a contrivance. He has him thrown into a pit with the lions, but the lions are entertained by the cockroach, mouse, and cricket, and he's able to get out, whilst they go and stop the princess from marrying somebody else who's a sort of high up lord who eats too much. And there's various Basile has a lot of fun with these various small creatures sort of burrowing under the bedclothes until they make sure that the overeating lord ends up splattering his meal all over the bed, and as a result is unable to consummate his wedding to the princess, and he has to consummate in 3 nights, otherwise he'll be thrown out. And then the hero is able to come back and wed her. So it's a very strange, very silly story. I don't know why Disney hasn't adapted it, but they haven't.
It rather depends how he spills his meal, I guess.
Well, it comes out mostly from his rear. So they might want to change that, but I think that's the fun. In many ways, that's the point of it all, and the fun of it. It's sort of not what you're necessarily expecting.
You don't have to be polite on this podcast, I can assure you.
Well, I'll bear that in mind, actually. Yeah,
everybody likes a fart joke, and a shart joke in this case. But it would kind of put you off, if your bridegroom sort of redecorated the bed with the feces. But
yes, there are areas of the story that Basile doesn't necessarily go into great detail on, but you imagine that there's all kinds of poor servants having to run around changing sheets and cleaning things up, but somehow not managing to get their eyes on the cockroach, mouse, and cricket and sweep them away. But I guess that could all I wonder if that's a story right for a novelization where you could really go into detail on exactly what's going on behind the scenes there.
I dare say you could. Are there any other stories of his that kind of stand out for you, or maybe known to people listening? I don't know how well known he is.
Yeah. He's got a lot of stories that have become hugely famous. I mean, one of the stories that he tells, he's not the originator of the story because it's been told all over the world, but it's a very important version of it. And that's the story of a character who he calls Cenerentola, who, of course, in French then became Cendrillon, and in English Cinderella. And his version is very recognizable, the story that we would recognize as Cinderella. There are certainly earlier versions. There's even, I think, a 9th century Chinese version of the story. But Basile's version of that story is really familiar to anybody everybody who knows Cinderella today would recognize that as the story of Cinderella. So it seems to have had a direct influence on the people who then made that story popular, because it was told in France in the 1690s amongst the saloniers who told a lot of fairy tales and sort of had a big sort of publishing boom of fairy tales. So a few decades later than Basile. So his version of that is really important. He also told a version of the story of Rapunzel. And again, he has a slightly different name for her, and quite a different name for her, but it's very much the story that we would recognize as the story of Rapunzel. There's also a wonderful story actually about a brother and sister who get lost in the woods, or they get thrown out of the woods by their parents, and they have some bran, I remember correctly, and that they scatter in the hope that it will get them back home, but it gets eaten up by a donkey. But then, in this version, they don't find a magical cottage made out of sweets, but instead one of them gets taken by pirates and taken in a ship going across the sea, which then is beset by a storm, and they're swallowed by a giant whale and opened up eventually to be reunited with their sibling. So it goes off in a completely different direction, but it's a very colourful, entertaining tale. So there's a lot of stories where you'd recognise sort of strands of them, and I think it's one of the most exciting things with folklore when you notice these strands and you think, oh, I know what story this is, and then it goes off in a different direction from what you were expecting at all, and you realise it's in so many ways quite a different tale. And I think it's really fun when that happens. You sort of feel like you're almost pinning the story down, and then the story reminds you that, you know, stories can do whatever they want to do, really, and they can go off in their own sort of wild direction. So a lot of Basile stories have that feeling about them. There's that sort of energy throughout his collection that you're never completely sure if he's going to keep going in that direction that you're expecting, or if he's going to go off in some sort of wild tangent.
What do you think made him collect stories?
I think he was incredibly bored, and he was struggling with the life of a courtier and an administrator. He was sent to a lot of provincial towns and sort of places that were where he was working as a sort of local governor, and he would be collecting the taxes and doing a lot of the sort of bureaucratic work for the lords and the counts and the princes who ruled over the various kingdoms and principalities of Italy at that time. And he was very much a poet and a storyteller. That was, you know, I think where his heart and soul was. But to make ends meet, as has been the case for storytellers throughout history, he had to do other things. And I don't think he necessarily enjoyed that very much. I don't think he was very good at it either, which I think explains why he never seemed to last in a post for very long. His biography finds him constantly moving along, so I think he wasn't very good at holding down a position. But there are some letters that have come back, or that have survived of his, and many of which haven't been published in English. And I corresponded a lot with a professor who translated his tales, Nancy Canepa, who has a lot of those original sources, about the letters that he wrote to some of his relatives about how bored he was when he was in various places in the countryside, but that he would be picking up what he called sort of old wives' tales, or tales of ogres. A lot of the stories that he told include ogres as the sort of primary antagonist. And so I think those were something that distracted him from the tedium of the daily grind. And over many, many years, he would pick up those stories from the various different places where he was. And I imagine, you know, you can sort of, there's all sorts of different ways in which we can sort of imagine how he might have brought this collection together. But one way that I imagine is that a lot of people would be coming to him saying, "Oh my gosh, I haven't got, you know, I'm not able to pay your taxes," or he's coming to their farm saying, "You know, I'm sorry, but the count says you've got to pay up." They say, "Oh, I don't know, I don't have enough, but hey, sit down, let's have a glass of wine and let me tell you a tale." And he was probably always a sucker for a good tale. And so over the years, he collected them together and put them together in his collection, which his sister and a very canny bookseller brought out quite soon after he died.
Oh,
there's
so
details in it, which are it's the first really fully fantastical collection of fairy tales in Western literature. There are story collections. There's Straparola's Facetious Nights, which comes a century or so earlier, but isn't as consistently a collection of fairy tales as Basile. So it's quite a landmark really in European literature, and sort of extraordinary that it's sort of forgotten and overlooked so much,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the reasons why I wanted to write about him, to
Yeah,
shed a bit of light back on him.
absolutely. I mean, he was a fascinating character. Reading the stories in your book there, I mean, you really kind of bring him to life, and he does sound like an incredible character. Somebody that you might want to have a pint with, you know. But
He really is, yeah. And there was a wonderful sort of uh, eatery restaurant place it's on one of Naples's narrowest streets, an incredible street actually, where you really had to slither as you go down there. And it's a place that he wrote about in poetry, and various people, sort of well known sort of artists and poets of the time used to go there. Caravaggio went there and in fact got ambushed whilst he was there, and wounded not very long before he died. So it was one of those sort of wonderful. It sounds like one of those wonderfully atmospheric places where people would gather, and he I think that was one of those places where Basile would go and he would hear tales and would probably tell tales. And it's the sort of place that you'd imagine, you know, if I could go back 4 centuries in time and hang out with him, I'd love to go out with him to his, you know, his favorite haunt and have a few glasses of what was there? There was a particular wine that they drank at the time. Was it I've forgotten the name of it, but yeah, you know, you'd certainly have a good old night with him, I think.
I would think he'd be an extremely entertaining character to talk to, but it's kind of sad that he didn't actually see any of these stories of his in print, you know, during his lifetime.
No, well, he saw other things come out or be performed. He wrote courtly masques and sort of entertainments for the court, and various poems. So he did produce a lot and did have a literary life. But as is so often the case, the sort of the work for which he is, if he's remembered at all, the work for which he is remembered is the Conti delle Conti, the Tale of Tales, and that obviously was posthumous. But you know, that's I think that's par for the course really in the world of folklore and fairy tales and in the history of storytelling.
Very true. I was down the archives in the last year checking a date for something that we were publishing, someone else's work. And I said to them, you know, people will thank us for this one day. It just won't be in our lifetime. But,
No.
But someday people go, oh, Daddy did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, listen, a kind of amazing character. But then, I mean, what was he doing at Vesuvius? Or was he just living around the Naples area, or was this another?
Yeah, he was put in a post in what was the place called? Giuliano. It was so I'm just looking, yeah, because I've got because there was there were a few people who wrote about the eruption at the time. So one of them, yes, it was in 1631, and one of his contemporaries wrote about the scourges of the conflagration were scarcely extinguished when the just God, perceiving that the Neapolitans were not yet repentant, sent another kind of chastisement, namely a disease of the throat, which proved so cruel and contagious that it appeared to be the plague, and carried off numbers of the people in a short space of time. And among these were many notable people. And he goes on to mention Giambattista Basile, one of the leading poets of our time. So that's that also coming back to the point about, yes, the stories weren't published at the time, but he was recognised as being a literary figure of the time. But yeah, he was working in Giugliano, which was just a few miles from Naples. I mean, this was the problem in his life. I think that he kept getting pushed from one post to another, and just not really able to hold on to them for very long. And that just happened to be the one that he was in at that time. He was it was a role as a sort of local governor administrator. So he took the work wherever he could get it, I think.
It seems to have been a bit of a sort of trait at the time, because I mean, this is like during the Renaissance, and you think of a lot of the great, painters and sculptors and such like. And they were going from one place to another, or sometimes being apprehended and brought back again because they didn't want to lose their famous painter, But people did seem to have kind of itchy feet, and move
They
around.
did. I think people moved around a lot, and it's a reminder because we think of the world having become much smaller in the sort of the post-industrial revolution age, but the amount of travelling that people did when it was very slow and would take quite a while to get around, but they really did move around. I mean, I guess it also says something about Italy being perhaps quite a sort of cohesive sort of area that you could move from one state, one city, one principality to another with maybe not with ease, but at least fairly often during the course of a life.
And of course, we have its tendency to think of Italy as like one country, but during that period, I mean, it was all city-states that were all warring against each other.
It was absolutely, yes, and I think there was so Basile. Also coming from Naples, which has always seen itself as being a very much a separate place with its own language. But you had to go where the money was, and he did work for the Viceroy of Naples for a little while. Naples also was under Spanish control, so I think there's all these different aspects of politics that come into the lives of all of the fairy tellers that I've written about, but that they all seem to have been influenced by and affected by the whoever was invading or whatever disaster was sort of happening or was just around the corner. And in his case, I think the Spanish occupation was really crucial. Spain was really very much this huge superpower at the time, and they had control of Naples, so that made it difficult for literary figures being in Naples, and I think that's another of the reasons why he was moved around a lot. And it's also something that was one of the inspirations for his collection, and maybe one of the reasons why it wasn't published in his lifetime, because by writing it in the Neapolitan dialect, he was able to write something that the Spanish authorities couldn't understand, but also by writing fantasy or writing fairy tales, they wouldn't give it any attention, and they wouldn't notice the amount of sort of satirical bite that there is in the collection. And sometimes it's just in the fact that so many princes and kings and rulers are shown in his stories to be absolute buffoons. But sometimes it's actually more direct, because there are a lot of between the 5 days that the stories are set over. It's 50 tales over 5 days, and between each day there's a very biting satire in which he really goes really hard and directly at the sort of the ludicrousness of the world and worldly values. And there's some lovely passages where he really lets rip, and he sort of says things like the life of a courtier is a nightmare, because you're putting all your efforts into appeasing your master, not knowing whether you'll get fed the next day, and all your efforts end up going to the wind. And you get these sort of furious diatribes coming out in these satires that sort of are kind of stopgaps between each set of the tales that I think are very revealing of Basile's own point of view.
I mean, again, it's the folk tales being from the people. It's going to be full of satire and ridicule of their superiors. There's a wonderful little thing in Yeats's collection of Irish folk tales, where the devil is trying to make a deal with this guy who keeps ripping him off. And he says, well, I have to go, says the devil. I have to head off to Downing Street. We've been very busy since the Tories got back into power. So, I mean, regardless of what your politics are, that was being written at the end of the 19th century. So it's satire in a way that you can get off with, because the people in authority aren't going to be paying any attention.
Exactly, and I think that's a really crucial thing about it, that you've got that freedom. And I think for a lot of it, there's that question sometimes being asked, like, why would a sophisticated literary figure like Giambattista Basile, who's recognized as a poet of his time, why would they give their time to fairy tales? Which I think is not necessarily the right question to be asking anyway, because actually fairy tales of, will always justify in themselves anybody's attention. But there's so much that you can do with them, and that, of course, is one of them. And that freedom for somebody who's probably constantly under constriction and is being restrained by how they can express themselves. It gives them that freedom to really let rip and have a proper shout at the ludicrousness of worldly affairs and their anger with authorities. There's a lovely passage in one of the stories where ogres are often the speakers of truth in Basile's stories, and in one of the tales you have these two ogres chatting to each other in the woods, saying, what's going on in the world? Have you been out into the world and seen what's going on, or in the court and the world of the world of men and women? And the ogre says, "Oh gosh, yes, it's just the usual rubbish that you always see. Corruption everywhere. The least capable are being elevated to high office, and all the wise people are being crushed. And huge amounts of pots of money are being made by the people with absolutely no morals." And it's a lovely passage to read, because it's just these two monsters talking to each other, who happen to be talking to each other whilst being eavesdropped on by a young woman who has fled from the court, and actually only not much later she ends up killing one of them so that she can use his lard to cure her beloved, who has been trapped in a rather dodgy plot that has given him a sort of fatal disease that can only possibly be cured by being smothered in ogre lard. So there's this whole sort of mad plot going on around it, but for a moment Basile sort of slows down the story so that he can we can really listen to these ogres giving their sort of tuppence worth on the ludicrousness of the world.
Yeah, a fabulous piece of social comment, and just sadly timeless, unfortunately.
It is, yes, and I think there's a lovely lesson there as well, that we should always listen to the monsters, and I think that I don't think every storyteller of his time would have done it like that, but I think it's revealing of what I think of as Basile's wisdom, really, that he recognizes that it's it's not just amongst the courtiers and the literary people, even though he was himself very much a sort of literary clubbing sort of figure who belonged to various academies of the time and knew a lot of well-known scientists and poets and so on. But he fully recognized that that's not necessarily where you're going to get the most accurate sort of diagnosis of what's happening in society.
Is any of it, is his his Tale of Tales book, is that available in English at all? Do you know?
It is, yes. It's been translated in a few different editions. I think Richard Burton, the great explorer, did the first English version back in the late 19th century. But there's a version published about a few years ago now, translated by Nancy Canepa, which is a really, really good sort of fruity and expressive edition of it, and as I believe very accurate translation, with all 50 tales in it, and it's it's a book that I would recommend to anybody.
I hope you're taking note of this, Rhonda, for potential birthday presents.
Yes, exactly. Add it, because I remember you've got so many wonderful collections of stories on your shelves, but if you haven't got Basile's Tale of Tales,
well, that's an omission, I'm afraid, but it sounds right up my street as well. So,
yes, I think you
bring him. Wonderful for you to bring him back into the spotlight again, and so making people aware of the fact that that this collection is out there and is worth reading. But then in your book, The Fairy Tellers, you go on then to bring in stories from the Middle East, which is printed at that time, in France, I believe, with Hanno Dyab.
Hannah Diab, yeah. And another really wonderful character. I think somebody who, Bazile, I think, was somebody who knew his worth and was sort of furious at the world for not recognizing it. Whereas I think Hannah Diab was somebody who just didn't really realize. He lived in Aleppo, and his family worked in the souk and worked in the rag trade, I guess. And they were Maronites, so Christian Catholic Arabs. And he was sort of earmarked for a career in the monastery. He was going to go, into a clerical career, going to take his vocation and take his vows in a monastery in Mount Lebanon. But he had a sort of itchy feet about it and doubts about it, and came back to Aleppo and ended up getting involved with an archaeologist, Paul Lucas, who was a sort of court archaeologist to King Louis XIV and had been traveling around the Near East collecting various treasures to bring back to the French court. And so Hannah got employed as his dragoman, or his translator. What we're incredibly lucky with is that Hannah left behind a memoir of his experiences. So he describes in very candid detail his experience meeting this archaeologist, who he thought was the most incredible figure, who sort of magically dragged him out of the life that he was living, where he was either going to be working in the souk, selling clothes that he didn't really want to, or living in a monastery, pretending to be a monk when he didn't really want to be one. But instead, he got to travel all over the the world as he knew it with Paul Lucas, and they went to Egypt. So they travelled to Tunis. They went to the Bardo of Tunis, one of the great palaces of the time, and they crossed the Mediterranean to Italy, and eventually into France, where he was presented at the court of Versailles to the Sun King, King Louis XIV himself, along with 2 desert jerboas that he had brought with them from, if I remember correctly, I think it was from Algeria, or certainly from North Africa, and were presented because when you arrived at the court of Versailles, you had to bring some sort of curiosity, and the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne at the time, had a board on which were depicted all the known animals of the time, but they didn't include these 2 creatures. So he was very excited about that, and that gave Hannah Diab some real plus points, and gave Paul Lucas, his sort of master and employer, plus points as well. And so he was sort of handed around between the chambers of Versailles, taken to a lot of the various sort of princesses' chambers. They were fascinated by him. He was wearing his traditional Syrian garb, and he describes in some detail how he'd be sort of handled by these various aristocrats, sort of plucking at his moustaches and sort of picking at his clothes, asking various questions about him, which is sort of quite revealing, I suppose, of sort of attitudes of the time. Before he was sort of presented to the king, and eventually spent quite some time in Paris with Paul Lucas, who had this amazing sort of apartment full of all these treasures that he'd brought back from his various adventures. I think most of them he had to give to the king, but some of them he was able to keep in his apartment, which became a sort of museum. And amongst the visitors there was Antoine Galland, who was the man who was translating the 1001 Nights, this amazing collection of stories, and he'd already translated several volumes of it, and it was really taking off, becoming a huge success in the sort of literary salons of Europe at the time, and especially in France, and especially in Paris. So many sort of great stories that had already been told, like the City of Brass and the story of Scheherazade, and the Fisherman and the Jinn, and all these sort of wonderful tales. But some of the tales that hadn't been told, and were then told by Hannah Diab, when Antoine Galland asked him, "Do you know any sort of stories? Because I'm running out of stories, and people want them. My publisher wants more volumes. They want more." And it's the sort of the curse of the successful author, or in this case successful translator, that they're being sort of badgered for more material, more content. And so it was Hannah who gave him that content. And the first tale he told him was the tale of Aladin and the Wonderful Lamp, which of course is now the most famous of all the tales of the 1001 Nights, but it isn't actually strictly speaking, a tale from the 1001 Nights, because it was a tale that was told by Hannah Dyab, and there is no precedent to it. It was he who told it. We can sort of look back through the history of folklore and say, there are parallels with this story here or there, but it really is a truly original story that seems to have been handed from him to Antoine Galland and then transformed. And we don't know to what extent Galland transformed. I think he probably transformed it quite a bit with his own skills, but I think the core of the story was very much the story that was told by Hannah Dyab. And one of the really interesting things about that is that the story seems to echo things that had happened in Hannah's own life, because it's the story of a young man who doesn't really know where he's going in life until he is befriended by a stranger from another land who's incredibly knowledgeable and who wants him to come with him on his journeys. And in Aladin, that's the case of his sort of evil so-called uncle. But in real life, it was Hannah and Paul Lucas. And there's even a description in his memoir of going to visit a cave outside Aleppo, or in the Keftine, I think the Keftine Hills near Aleppo, where Paul Lucas wanted somebody to go into this cave to dig out the treasures inside. And he managed to get a passing goat herd to go into the cave, and he brought out a butter lamp and a ring, and some other trinkets. And of course, the lamp and the ring are the two sort of famous artifacts that become a core part of the story of Aladdin. So there's all these sort of parallels, and there's been sort of discussed by various scholars, even to the extent of how the palace in Aladdin, when the genie creates this amazing palace for Aladdin, that's the sort of the most stupendous palace ever seen in the world, how that may well have been influenced by Hannah having the experience of going to the court of Versailles. I think it may also have been influenced by him visiting the Bardo of Tunis as well, which is sort of something that scholars have given less attention to. But I think it's really a composite of any palace that he'd seen. And, in his fictional tale, he was creating the sort of the ultimate Uber palace. But Versailles, certainly being this incredibly famous palace, does seem to have had a big impact on him. And you can see that in the way that even in the story, with certain details about sort of the construction of the palace that seem to reflect something of the architecture of Versailles. So there's all these really interesting things going on. And then he told other tales, including the story of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, which is one of those really famous tales from the 1001 Nights. So I think, and he told about more than a dozen other tales, and all sorts of very, very interesting ones. But those are the two really, really well-known ones, for which really we should all remember Hannah Dyab as a huge figure in the history of folklore and of storytelling. But as we've already discussed, that's not how it goes. And it was Antoine Galland who got to produce those stories and get them into print, whilst Hannah was sort of eventually sort of booted out of Paris, didn't quite get the position that he'd been hoping to get, and ended up sort of going back to Aleppo and having a career in his family's shop in the souk in the end, after all.
Was he aware that these stories had been published and were being?
He didn't express any awareness. No, in his memoir, there's no indication that he knew what he'd done, loosed into the world, this incredible sort of gift to the rest of the world. He even when he talks about telling these tales, he doesn't make a big thing of them. He says, this old guy came along to Lucas's apartment and wanted to listen to these tales, so I told him a few of the stories that I could think of. And it's passed over in just a few sentences, really, whilst before he goes on to discuss other things. So I think he didn't really. I don't think he fully appreciated the power of what he had passed on. I don't think he was necessarily in himself a storyteller in the way that somebody like Giambattista Basile was. But he was a storyteller in the sense that he was able to tell these tales, and that he also wrote down his own life story in a memoir, which is, a very enjoyable read and a very, very compelling read. So, so he's a sort of, there's a lot of interesting sort of layers to his story, and to the way that he was treated, and the sort of geopolitics of the time that he lived in. So yeah, he's another fascinating character, I think.
I mean, when you think of the impact that a story like Aladdin and the Lamp has had in Western culture, from, a Disney cartoon to pantomimes in, local amateur dramatic groups, or,
Yeah,
local groups doing Aladdin as a pantomime at Christmas. It's a staple, really.
it is, and it's such an enduring story. It's the ultimate sort of Oriental tale, as it's known. That I feel like Hannah deserves a bit of credit there. Almost that every theatrical program for every pantomime of Aladdin should at least say something, originated by Hannah Dyab. It's had so many different variations, as you mentioned, the Disney films and the pantomimes. There's in Denmark, it became this huge thing in the early 19th century when a Danish poet, Oehlenschläger, created a theatrical version of Aladdin that was seen as being a sort of metaphor for what Denmark was going through at that time, as this sort of little nation that was becoming very powerful suddenly, or was sort of really throwing its weight around the world, but was also bringing in a lot of wealth from the East. So it has this sort of ability to be retold with all these layers of meanings, and that's the power of story itself, I think, that probably transcends what Hannah did with it. But he is there at the origin of it. It may well be that he heard some version of that story in one of the coffee houses of Aleppo, which where he grew up, and where storytellers were, very, very rife at that time. There's the sort of travellers' accounts of Aleppo at the time described the Hakawatis, the storytellers who would do the rounds of the coffee houses and tell their tales with sort of wonderful skill and lots of sort of cliffhangers and narrative techniques. But the fact that there isn't any other version of the story from before that time that can be pinned sort of to the identity of Aladdin suggests that Hannah Dyab, had a significant role in creating that tale. So I think we definitely owe him a bit of, I think anybody who's enjoyed that story, that, we do owe him a little bit of thanks for that.
I was just talking the other night to a young storyteller that I'm mentoring at the moment, and he was talking about wanting to use stories to create original pieces based on folk tales, but very much his own take on it. And we're saying, well, basically that's what storytellers have been doing forever, because all these stories had to start somewhere. They didn't just spring into people's mind fully formed, or they're stories that you've had versions of, you've put your own bits into, or you have actually just made up from scratch. So they have to have a beginning.
So yeah, and I think with for example, with the story of Alibab and the 40 Thieves, there's a Syrian folk tale about the which is a similar story to that, but where instead of thieves they're jinn. So they're these sort of magical beings who inhabit this cave. And that's an example where you can sort of trace that story through to a source. And I think there are other sources where you could say, oh, well, that may have contributed an element of it. But I also think that there are certain storytellers who tell a story and shape a story in such a way that it becomes the sort of definitive version. An example of that, I suppose, is actually another storyteller that I've written about in the fairy tales is Madame de Villeneuve, Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve, who told the story of Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty and the Beast is one of the oldest tales in human history. This idea that of the girl who sort of has to in some way spend time with some kind of odious creature who then is transformed or becomes or proves to be this sort of handsome, wonderful being, and they live happily ever after. So that sort of template was there long, possibly for thousands of years before her. I mean, I think there's different theories of research, but some that trace that story back an awfully long way. You can certainly trace it back to things like the Latin storyteller Apuleius's Golden Ass. But Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve told that story with a very specific narrative structure, where it starts off with a merchant who is fleeing from a storm, and so he has to hide in or seek refuge in this house that he suddenly finds in the middle of the woods, and he eats there not knowing who his host is, and then plucks a rose as he's about to depart because his youngest daughter Belle asked him for a rose, and then he's accosted by this beast, and then is told that he's going to have to stay in the house, so he can swap places with somebody else, and eventually his daughter Belle goes to swap places with him, lives with the beast, is completely sort of horrified by him at first, but then gradually warms to him, then goes back to see her father when he seems to be ill, and in one of the magical contrivances in the house she's able to see that her father is ill, and then when she comes back the beast is dying, and she revives him by expressing her love for him, and then he turns into this handsome prince and they live happily ever after. And in Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve's version of the story, in fact, it then carries on. She's got this sort of I would say wonderful, I know some people would disagree, a sort of fantasy story that follows on, that goes into the backstory of how the prince became a beast, because he was a prince of the fairy kingdom and he was cursed by another fairy who he had spurned, and there's all sorts of sort of machinations that go on in the fairy kingdom that led to him becoming the beast before Belle even came near to him. But she's called Belle. She's Beauty in that story. He is La Bête the Beast, and it has that narrative structure that it's kept so that in the famous Disney film of the 90s, and the one that's sort of been made more recently, that's exactly the storyline that they follow. So although it was retold by other storytellers later, it was Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve who set that down with that what I think of as that sort of that narrative template, and sort of made it into the story that then became the ultimate sort of enduring version of it.
Well, and it's a strange one as well, because it has elements in it where, if you've read a kind of a condensed version or a Disney version, there are servants who are apes in courtier dress. And there are magic windows that you can look through, and you can see a theatre, or you can see anywhere in the world that you want to. So it's sort of like live streaming entertainment,
Yes, it's amazing that it's scenes. Yeah, where she watches some of the plays that are going on in Paris at the time, and she's really entertained by them. I think those scenes are lovely, and then she watches a revolution going on in Istanbul, or in Constantinople, I think, and so it's that sort of magic it's a window, isn't it? A magic window into all these things going on, and the apes, the monkeys, the sort of court of monkeys that follows her around, is reflected in some of the art that you can see in some of the 18th century chateaus of that time, where they were very interested in the idea of, this is pre-Darwin, but it's this idea of sort of dressing up monkeys in courtly garb, which was seen as a sort of fantastical, sort of entertaining thing, rather than having any sort of scientific interest in it. It was just sort of something that was seen as a rather surreal thing to paint in wallpaper, sort of around the chateaus, or to put into books. As Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve did.
Well, I mean, when I was a kid, you watch Animal Magic on the telly with Johnny Morris. I'm showing me age here. And it was at a time when zoos had chimps tea parties on a regular basis every day at 1:00 or whatever. You would have chimpanzees dressed up as, in human clothes, with a nice tea party with the tablecloth on, and the teapot and cups and saucers, and there would be cakes and stuff like that. And of course they would just be all over it, and drinking out the teapot and things like that, which of course was considered hilarious to people. These days we would have a completely different attitude towards animals being used for that sort of entertainment. But at the time, And I'm talking, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
It was, it was the norm. There was chimps tea parties and mini zoos. So it's something that carried on into, much later than you may think.
Yeah, that's amazing actually. Yeah, how long back, I mean, I don't know if they would have read the original Beauty and the Beast, but certainly that idea had endured.
Mm. But it was kind of like a mockery, because here was things that looked a bit like us, but
Yeah.
behaving like animals, and that was fun. It was a bit of a laugh, but she was quite a character herself, wasn't she?
She had a really topsy-turvy life. She was born into the aristocracy of La Rochelle. But very sort of well-born, and married a well-born gentleman, Monsieur de Villeneuve. But he turned out to be a bit of a rake, and ran up massive gambling debts, and then got himself killed in a duel, I think, near Pamplona. So she ended up penniless and had a child who died in infancy. So things took quite a sad turn in her life, and she ended up going to Paris, where she got herself a job as a housekeeper for a playwright, Monsieur de Crébillon, who was one of the great playwrights of that time. He was a rival of Voltaire for the sort of the laurels of sort of being one of the great sort of French authors of the time, or French playwrights and poets anyway. And she worked for him as his housekeeper, and he was a really sort of fascinating, strange character. He brought in lots of stray animals to his house, and you could see the influence on her storytelling there, that he had lots of cats and dogs in his house, and lots of plants, and he used to sit there with his pipe and smoked and incessantly. He was an absolute chain smoker. He was known, in fact, by a lot of people at the time as Le Fumeur, the smoker, because his pipe was never out of his mouth. I don't know quite what kind of an atmosphere that was for all these dogs and cats. Probably quite sort of stifling, but all kinds of people would come and visit his household, including Casanova, who came to have French lessons with him, and mentioned it in his memoirs, sort of coming to visit de Crébillon. And I think it's sort of one of those almost sort of wonderful sort of moments where literary history could have come together in a really interesting way, but didn't quite, because you've got Casanova, the sort of famous sort of lover of literary history, and then you've got Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve, who wrote one of the most famous love stories of all time. But of course, to Casanova, she was just this sort of middle-aged housekeeper that he wasn't really very interested in. So there you go. But it was quite a sort of strange household that she lived in, and she wrote various stories, many stories. I mean, Beauty and the Beast is just one of them. It's the one that's obviously survived, but she wrote many others. Some very colourful, very surreal tales with sort of magical nymphs and underwater kingdoms and journeys and quests beyond the known world, with all sorts of interesting characters in them. I think La Belle et la Bête is definitely her outstanding work, but there's a lot of other sort of imaginative storytelling that she did along the way. But it was hard for her to find a censor, actually, even though de Crébillon himself was one of the royal censors. It was very difficult at that time for a woman to have her work published. And fantasy novels in France at the time were seen as being quite a sort of disgraceful thing for a woman to write. So it was brought out in a sort of unofficial version, with her name just sort of indicated by some asterisks. She's just sort of Madame de star. And one of the results of that is that it was very easy to plagiarize. You didn't have to get any permission to use the story. And so other writers very quickly came along and retold that story and made it more popular than her version, actually. But it was Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve who set up that sort of narrative that other storytellers then sort of went along and ran with.
Another woman who you write about here is Dorchen Wilde, who was a significant contributor to folk tales, but who probably very, very few people have ever heard of. Do you want to elaborate on?
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's interested in storytelling obviously knows about the Brothers Grimm and their children's and household tales. And Dorchenville is one of the people who was one of the main contributors to them. There were a number of really interesting, very, I think, skillful storytellers who told stories to the Brothers Grimm. There's Mary Hassenpflug, who told the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and the robber bride, and many others. There's a whole sort of host of storytellers. But Dorchenville told the Grimms some really key stories, including Hansel and Gretel, and a whole bunch of others. And she ended up having a relationship with Wilhelm Grimm. She fell in love with him when she was quite young. I think it took a little bit longer for him to reciprocate that feeling, but they did eventually marry and lived happily ever after together. And she was with the Grimm brothers when they produced their collection, and they went through many failures, really, or disappointing sales before the collection really took off, and they become this sort of cause célèbre of the literary world of their time. But she grew up in like so many of them, she grew up in a very tempestuous political atmosphere. You had the Napoleonic invasions, so where they lived in Kassel in the region of Hesse, it was under the French army. It was Napoleon's brother who became the king of that region, and in fact employed Jacob Grimm as his librarian. Whilst Wilhelm was very unwell, he would sort of be bedridden and dependent on all sorts of vapors and mercury ointments and all kinds of what was seen as the medicine of the time to try and help him get better. But he would be sort of scribbling away, writing down the various stories that they'd been collecting. And as his friendship with Dorchen grew, she told him many of her tales. There's an account of he wrote down various sort of diary extracts about the storytelling through which we can trace back who told the tales and when. And there's one account where Wilhelm, he wasn't a traveller. I mean, he was too unwell most of the time to travel, but on one occasion he did travel quite a distance to visit Dorchen and her sisters, and he gives the account of listening to Dorchen in I think it's in the summer house. So one of those little sort of garden huts where they'd have a stove and they'd sit by the stove. And she told him some tales. And on one afternoon, she told him 3 tales, which were the story of Sweetheart Roland, the 6 swans, and, I think it's the Singing Bone, which is one of those sort of wonderfully grisly tales where two brothers have a fight. One of the brothers kills the other, but then the murder is eventually revealed when the bone is used by a shepherd to make a flute, and then of its own accord, it sings the tale of what happened to it. And so the culprit is finally, justice is finally done. The story of the 6 swans is also one of those really sort of enduring tales. It's not, Dorchen isn't, obviously, we've sort of gone over this. She's not the originator of the story. It's been passed down through various different routes and ages. But it's a sort of glorious tale of 6 brothers who are transformed into swans by the sort of evil, wicked stepmother who has married the king and doesn't want doesn't want him to pass his inheritance down to his children. So the daughter is left behind, having to magically weave some special shirts out of the nettles and the plants in the woods, so that they can be thrown over the bodies of these swans, and then they will be magically transformed back into young men. But along the way, she marries a king who brings her to his castle, but she's taken a vow of silence while she's weaving these magical shirts. And so it's a bit of a strange story, really. She's weaving these shirts whilst refusing to say anything. So nobody quite knows who she is. And her mother-in-law becomes quite suspicious of her. And so as mother-in-laws of stories of that time do, she whenever she gives birth, she has the babies taken away and blood smeared on her lips and accuses her of being a cannibal who's been eating her own children. Which, because she's taken a vow of silence, she cannot deny. And so eventually she's taken to the stake to be burned. And it just so happens that she's brought her 6 shirts along with her at the time, and which she has now finished weaving, and she's able to throw them over the swans, which just so happen to fly over just as she's about to burn. And so they're turned back into these young men. She's completed her task and is now able to speak and to say, "I am innocent." And at that very moment, she is therefore saved. And but because they've already started the fire, they have to burn somebody. So the wicked mother-in-law is burned in her stead.
Well, it'd be a shame to waste it, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. It's good firewood there. But the thing that I find fascinating is the idea of this young woman. I think she was, I can't remember the age that she was at that stage, maybe 18, 19 years old. And she's sitting there with Wilhelm, who she's in love with, and she's telling him these really grisly stories. Wilhelm Grimm loved storytelling. So I imagine that he fell in love with her at that, by listening to her telling these stories and the wonderful way that she was able to tell them. And it seems like she told him a lot more stories over the years, and eventually many of them made it into print and became some of these fabulous tales. Hansel and Gretel is probably the sort of most famous one that she's said to have told, but it's slightly unclear whether she definitely told that one. So it's one of those stories that, scholars love to have sort of different debates about who was the actual storyteller of it. But there's I did a bit of analysis on sort of looking at the there's various editions of the Grimm's stories. And so there's the earlier editions from 1810 and then much later editions going sort of through to the 1820s, 1830s. And you can see differences in the stories as the Grimm's shape them more and more. And what that means though is that when you go back to those early editions, you're getting quite close to listening to the original voices of the original storytellers. And if you sort of divide some of those stories up between the storytellers who are believed to have told them, you can start to see certain patterns. So, for example, there's Dorchenwild, who was the daughter of an apothecary. So, along with the Napoleonic Wars happening and soldiers coming into the area and taking over castle and having to sort of keep out of trouble with all of that happening, she was also the daughter of a very bad-tempered apothecary, and she had to help in the shop and had to do a lot of the housework. There were many sisters in the house. And I think they had a lot of work to do. And then occasionally the soldiers would be billeted in their house, which must have been quite a stressful situation to be in. And then on the other hand, you have one of the other storytellers called Mary Hasenpflug, who was the daughter of a government official, and they had servants in the house. So she had a very different sort of lifestyle. And if you look at the content of the stories in the first edition, it's noticeable that in Dorchen's stories, the girls who are usually the leading character in the stories are doing a lot of housework. There's a lot of moments in the stories where they are sweeping the floor, they are having to do chores, and they are often being rewarded for doing their chores well, which is one of those tropes that happens in a lot of fairy tales. Whereas in Mary Hasenpflug's stories, that's not such an emphasis. That doesn't happen so much because presumably she would have had servants to do that. It wouldn't have been something that she would have sort of been so aware of. Although she had one of the things about her was that she used to have fainting fits and to sort of have to pass out quite often. And so there's I think a couple of her stories where in fact Snow White is one of them where the leading character loses consciousness. So that may well be a reflection of her life. I think it's all, one has to be a bit wary about connecting these sort of story elements too much to the storyteller, but I think one of the things I find quite persuasive is the sense, and there was a storyteller and writer who I interviewed about Dorchenwild, especially, called Kate Forsyth, who's written novelizations about the lives of various people in the world of fairy tales, and it was the idea that we discussed that storytellers are drawn to certain stories, and so there may be something in that story that resonates with something in that person's life or in their experience that somehow enables them to tell that story with a particular sort of passion or particular imaginative vitality that gives that story that that makes that version that then becomes quite an enduring version of that story.
Well, I mean, storytellers, when you're telling the story, you do put a bit of yourself into it, and you draw on your own life experiences and emotions. So I can see why she would put in details like having to work, in the household. She sounds like quite an interesting character, though, reading your description of her. I mean, she sounds like quite a striking looking woman, and but quiet and kind of shy, withdrawn almost. Is that a right?
Yeah, I think she was quite a humble person, who was very much in the shadow of other people in her family as she was growing up. And then when she married Wilhelm, she was very much in the shadow of the Grimms. And there's various letters and diaries that have been collected that she left behind, which give sort of little snippets into her life. Not a huge, it's not it's not a huge volume of autobiography, but you do get little glimpses. And I think she was somebody, she was always worrying about other people. She seemed to always worry about the health of others, the health of Wilhelm. I mean, he was a very sickly man, so she was always having to worry about his health. She also got on really well with her brother-in-law, Jacob. And I think there's some really touching moments where she writes in, I think, one of her letters or diaries about how one of her favorite parts of the day was when she and Jacob would wake up and they'd have their coffee together. So I think she was somebody who seems to have had quite sort of simple ambitions in life, and loved her family, her loved ones, but didn't have a sort of ambition to produce her own works and to put her name in print or anything like that. But certainly, there's often, I think there's a lot of people like that who have played a really crucial role in the history of storytelling, who never sought the limelight themselves. And in some ways you see that in some of the stories, actually, where characters can be punished for being seeming to be too flighty. Some attitudes, I think she was probably quite a conservative person. So some of her attitudes, we're going back, this is going back to the very early 19th century. So, we're going back over 200 years. So the things that her stories would punish girls for are not necessarily what we might think, anybody deserves to be punished for today. But, she in that sense, I think her stories tell us a little bit about the times that she lived in and the values of a provincial young German woman of the time.
Yeah, it was interesting that reading Chuck Zipes' introduction to his translation of the first two volumes of them, the original chairman. So it's as near as you're going to get really to the original source material, which was changed later. And it was after they were married, he said, that the wicked stepmother was introduced, because before that it was the mother.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I talked to Jack, actually, to Jack Zipes about them. Obviously he's done a huge amount of research on the Grimms and as you say, yes, he published one of those sort of fantastic versions of the Children's and Household Tales not that long ago. So yes, and so it is interesting to see those changes, and in fact, it almost a sort of counterpart to what I was saying just then. Actually, is that also that as sometimes we think of the world getting sort of more and more liberal as time goes on, or going on a sort of linear trajectory of sort of ideas and values and so on, but actually in some ways it is often very circular and sort of twisted and thorny, the pathways that things go through. And that in the case of the Children's Household Tales, they become more and more they lean more and more into a sort of conventional mainstream 19th century values as the volumes as they go on, and as they become more popular. With each volume, they seem to sort of grow in popularity, but they also become more conservative in with a small c, in the sense that they're sort of appealing to that sort of that evolving middle class society that was the book buying public, and sort of the values that they wanted to see in the stories that they would read to their children. And it's a developing thing. I mean, the idea of children's literature is developing at that very moment. So it's something that is very much sort of in formation. And that's all, I think fascinating part of the history of that collection.
Yeah. Because in the original version of Hansel and Gretel, it's the mother that says, we've got to get rid of these kids. We don't have any food. We're starved. So we're going to have to get rid of them. But after the Grimms marry and have children, they couldn't imagine a mother doing that to her own child. So then that's when they get substituted with stepmothers, wicked stepmothers, who are jealous of this, the other woman's children and want rid of them. And obviously have no personal attachment to them themselves. They're just a burden to her. Or rivals to her own children. So there was a weird little story, because there was a couple that got dropped from the original first edition and didn't make it. There was a bizarre little one called Playing at Butching. I don't know if you remember that one or not, but it's basically a couple of wee boys are playing. Their father had just butchered a sheep, and so they were playing at being butchers, and the eldest child had the middle child, there's three boys, the one's just a baby, has the middle child down on the ground, and he gets a knife and slits his throat, and he falls dead, bleeding to death. And the eldest child starts crying because they were playing, this was the moment. And the mother was watching from the upstairs window, and the middle child was her favourite, and she was furious. So she ran down the stairs. She was bathing the baby upstairs. She ran down the stairs, ran out, snatched the knife from the crying child, plunges it into his heart and kills him, and then thinks, oh shit, the baby, and runs back up the stairs, by which time the baby has slipped down into the bath and drowned. So the baby's dead as well. So she hangs herself. And the father comes home, and of course, everybody's dead. And that's it. There's no moral to it. It's just...
Yeah, it'd be lovely to be a fly on the wall on the discussion when they decided not to include that one.
I mean, it was in the first edition, but it didn't make it into the second.
Yeah.
Which is hardly surprising.
No.
But kind of moving on, you also have a collector of some amazing tales as well from Russia.
Yeah, Ivan Khudyakov, yeah. I mean, he's another... yeah. He's another amazing character. He grew up in Eastern Russia, very much away from the sort of the center of things, a long way from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but he made his way there eventually, produced this collection of Сказки, fairy tales, when he was only 18 years old. So a real prodigy. And, it didn't make a lot out of it, but it was at a time when you had Alexander Afanasyev producing fairy tales in Russia as well, and various other storytellers. It was the mid 19th century. So folklore was really taking off at that time, and he was a complex character who also got involved with various political organizations, including one group that decided to assassinate the Tsar, and he was involved with one of their members who did go and attempt to assassinate the Tsar, and obviously failed, but took a shot at him in I think it's the grounds of the Summer Palace of St. Petersburg, and so Ivan was arrested as one of his associates and ended up being sent off to Siberia and seeing out his days in one of the coldest places on earth, right out deep in Siberia before being brought into the asylum of the local administrative town to die and be thrown into a pauper's grave. So it was a really sort of tragic tale, and I thought quite a poignant one of somebody who created this sort of wonderful collection of tales. It's got some magical stories, some wonderful tales of Baba Yaga, the witch who lives in a hut on chicken legs, and sort of really sort of grisly and strange tales about her. And there's the story of the Firebird, where the prince sets off in search of this sort of majestic, glorious sort of bird that's been stealing apples from the king's tree, and he has to go through various challenges in order to find it and bring it back. And his brothers are his rivals who push him into a deep pit which he has to climb out of and do various or go through various ordeals before he can claim his right reward as the finder of the Firebird. So there are all these sort of strange and magical tales that he collected in. But one of my favorites is the story of, I think it's translated as Expensive Ivan. And it's about a young man who's got the power of shape-shifting. And so he changes himself into various different creatures or animals. And him and his father sort of develop a bit of a scam where he'll turn himself into a horse, and then his father will lead him to the market and sell him and get the best price he can. But then as soon as he's been sold, he'll just turn himself back into a young man again and wander back home. And then he'll turn himself into a cow, and they'll do the same thing. And so they build up quite a pot of money until he gets sold to a sorcerer, which is one thing you don't want to do when you're a shapeshifter, because the sorcerer can also shapeshift. And so they end up in this sort of shapeshifting contest where they turn themselves into various different creatures until I think one of them turns himself into a hawk, the other into a rooster, a snake, and a bird, and a chicken, all kinds of different things until eventually Ivan is able to kill off the sorcerer and to win the day and go back home with more money than he could possibly ever need. But it's a story, like many of Ivan's stories, which is rooted in rural life and the life of the countryside. And it's not necessarily obvious to us on first reading these stories, but you get accounts of some little details about the country fairs where the animals are being sold. Or you have in the Baba Yaga tales that the house on chicken legs seems to evoke something of the izba, the old sort of traditional Russian houses in the countryside, where they'd be in this sort of marshy, boggy landscape. And so they'd have to be sort of up on these sort of wooden poles, slightly above the ground level. And you'd have the bathhouse in some of the Baba Yaga stories. She gets the girl who is the sort of Cinderella character who has to go and do chores for the witch in order to prove her value, and she has to clean out the bathhouse, and she has to scrub the witch herself, give Baba Yaga a good scrubbing, and clean out the frogs and the eels and all the things that are in the bathhouse before being given a sort of chest full of gold as a reward for her good service. So you have all these stories that sort of say something about what it was like to live in the Russian countryside in the 19th century, and I think Ivan Khudjakov was somebody who was alert to that. He grew up very much outside of the elites. He grew up as a member of the ordinary people. So one of the reasons I wanted to write about him was because I felt like he really had, his life story had something to say about what we think of as being the sort of classic folklore storyteller. Is what people often think of the Grimms being, the ordinary people who go around the countryside collecting the tales from the mouths of the ordinary people. The Grimms didn't do that. They got the stories mostly from their neighbours, from people like Dortchenwald. But Ivan Khudjakov did go out and he did collect those stories from ordinary people. I think in a lot of cases he was working as a tutor on various estates in the sort of holidays in between his university studies, and he'd then listened to the people who worked on the estates, the serfs, and it was around the time of the emancipation of the serfs, so an enormous amount was happening, and he was embroiled in that. And he brought out this collection of stories, but he also brought out other books, one of which was called A Tutorial for Learning to Read and Write, and it was an attempt to help people who were moving into the cities during this period of industrialization, but also of emancipation of the serfs and of serfs coming out from the countryside, moving into the cities, into places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And he was trying to help them to develop literacy, and he was working as a tutor and a teacher as well. So he saw storytelling, I think, as being something that was connected with these things that were going on in a very significant way in the sort of political life of his country at that time. And so it's a sort of logical step that he got involved with this political group and involved with a group, the organization that plotted to assassinate the Tsar. They felt that the Tsar wasn't really moving things forward enough, and that, you know, a bigger change was needed. And obviously that was his undoing. He then ended up having a pretty miserable time. But he actually continued folklore collection even on his exile in Siberia, where he'd still keep sort of collecting stories and writing down an epic tale from amongst the people that he was exiled amongst. So he didn't stop really, but it was a sad end. I think there's various different sources of describing him sort of towards the end of his life, and one of them gives an account of seeing him when he was in the hospital just a few days before he died, and saying, you know, he was once this very eloquent, articulate person, but he had sort of been reduced to a sort of husk of himself, and he describes him as, you know, sort of strange noises coming out of his mouth and not really making any sense anymore. And he wasn't very, you know, he was still very young at that time. So again, he's one of those people who's just been sort of forgotten. I think, you know, Russian folklore isn't, you know, the most fashionable thing at the moment, but
it's still really good.
You know, but it's great stories, and it's his isn't. I don't think his are the greatest version of them. I think Alexander Afanasyev's fairy tales and his stories of Baba Yaga are really the sort of the outstanding Russian folk tales of that period. But and Afanasyev also had a really interesting life, but Ivan Khojikov's really did seem to me to say something about the life of storytellers themselves, and the way that they are sort of, that they give these gems to society, to the world, and are then sort of swept aside. And there's something almost mythic, almost sort of fairy tale like, but without the happy ending about that.
Yeah. The next chapter in the book, you're going back in time and also going east rather than looking at the European story.
We do. We go back quite a bit. Yes. Yeah. Yes. To meet Somadeva in Kashmir. Yeah. Yeah. The Kathasalit Sagara, which is the ocean of the streams of story, which I think wins for me the prize of the best titled fairy tale collection of all.
Can't argue with that, really.
Yeah. I think it's a glorious title, and it's a wonderful collection, full of magical, strange tales. There's lots of layers because, you know, it came out of Kashmir a millennium ago, so there's a lot to sort of unpack and unpeel before you can get into the stories. So I think from a research point of view, it was really, you know, it was quite a hard one to get into, but incredibly rewarding. I thought some of the stories were glorious once you sort of got through those layers of mythology and just learned what everything is, the sort of a kind of act of decoding, I suppose. There's a lovely story of the Golden City where you have this sort of local kind of ne'er-do-well, a sort of Aladin character, I suppose, who's not really been up to much good in his life. But then when he hears that the princess is going to marry whoever can tell him where the Golden City is, he says, "Oh, I know where it is." And of course she finds him out because he doesn't have a clue, and he's thrown out into the woods. And given advice by one of the gurus who lives in the woods, and then sort of goes on this sort of adventure where he gets involved in a shipwreck and meets various magical characters, and eventually is in a ship that crashes into the sea. But he is able to hold on to a marine banyan tree and survive whilst everybody else in the ship sinks down through a whirlpool to oblivion. And then rides on the back of a talking, a Garuda, a sort of mythical, sort of divine bird that carries him to this magical golden city, the very place that he pretended that he knew about but didn't. And now he's actually found it. And then he marries the beautiful sort of goddess who lives in this city. And the story, but then he falls, I think, into a pool of water and finds himself back in his home city, not knowing quite how he's ever going to get back to the place that he discovered. And the story sort of goes round in these cycles, which is sort of very meaningful in Hindu culture. And he sort of has to go through the adventure all over again. And it's sort of marvelously sort of luxurious and extravagant tale that is I think sort of quite characteristic of Somadeva's storytelling. And then there's the background of the stories where he's telling these stories to his queen, who during a time Kashmir was going through a civil war at the time. The queen had, I think, advised her husband to abdicate the crown in favor of his son, who had turned out to be not a very good leader, and had it was all sorts of terrible things were going on, and so she turned to her storyteller, to Somadeva, to her court poet, to soothe her in this time of troubles. And so he told her these tales, and they're tales that so sort of at the core of the story is the idea that of tales being told to these elite people, and they begin with the god Shiva and Parvati, his consort, telling tales, and then the tales being overheard by various sort of figures in up in the heavens. But gradually, as the story collection goes, as you go through the collection, stories are told by many different characters, and people are constantly telling stories. I think it's the most sort of polyphonic story collection I can think of, where you've got stories being interrupted and then told by somebody else in the middle of another story, and then coming back to another tale. And they're all kinds of different tales. So you have stories told by gods and kings and queens and generals and counselors, but then you go through and you're having stories being told by people who work in the market, but there's a story told by a seller of bedsteads, and then you even have stories being told by the demons in the fiery pits, and that sense that even the monsters can tell the stories, and in fact, the monsters often tell some of the best stories, as we know. So was that
of your ogres earlier? I mean, it's
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Who is the monster?
Yeah.
Which is a question that has been posed on more than one occasion.
Well, that is quite a question, and yes, that's been a question that's been troubling me quite a bit over the last couple of years whilst working on a book about monsters. But I think also there's something that when a monster can tell a story, then it is a monster who tells a story any more a monster, at least as we imagine monsters to be.
Hi, this is Rhonda. Tom and I want to say thank you for listening, and to let you know that we have a website too, Orkneyology.com. Also a YouTube channel and an independent press, Orkneyology Press. If you enjoy what we're doing, the best way you can help us to grow is to leave us a review and a like wherever you listen, and tell your friends. And if you're so inclined, you can buy us a dram on Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi. Just search for Ko-fi/Orkneyology. Thanks so much. Enjoy.
No, well, exactly. I think that's one of the sort of sad things in the history of storytelling, that there's all these storytellers who didn't necessarily get very much out of it. I mean, I suppose, like, so in the Grimm's case, for example, they didn't name the storytellers in their collection, but I think also that they didn't know that they should. I think that they saw these stories as coming sort of from the earth of the German people, the Volk, so it was maybe a different conception of where a story comes from.
Things haven't really changed, because in the late 50s, you had performers like Lonnie Donegan, who was a skiffle singer,
Mm-hmm.
and he was using a lot of songs that were written by, he ended up hit like Rock Island Line. It was from Lead Belly, and it was actually from an advert to start with, but then Lead Belly expanded it. And what he would do is, these old guys were still living in the Mississippi Delta as poor as shit, And Lonnie Donegan would have it credited as traditional, arranged by L. Donegan, and he would get the royalties. He would get the writer's royalties. Whereas these old guys that could really have done with the money, because they were living in poverty, were blissfully unaware that their song was a hit, a number one record in Britain. So it's kind of the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I think with somebody like Hannah Dyab in the story of Aladdin, there's definitely a parallel there. I think sometimes, if you think of like the amount of money that has been made by that story over the years, and I mean, not, even in his lifetime, I think it was quite a lucrative story. So there you go. 'Twas ever thus.
So the last storyteller collector in your book, it's a man that needs no introduction, really, isn't it?
Yes, he's the sort of the big celebrity of the book, I suppose. The sort of the big household name, Hans Christian Andersen. And I lost a lot of sleep about whether I should do a chapter about him, because he's so famous compared with all the other storytellers in the book. And, you know, he's had biographies about him. He's even had films made about him. You know, does he really need any more attention? But I also felt that perhaps he'd sort of fallen a bit out of fashion lately, and had sort of lost a little bit of, I think, wasn't being perhaps appreciated as much. And I loved his stories growing up. So I felt that if there was one storyteller, one fairy teller who had influenced me as a child, it was probably Hans Christian Andersen, because I have such vivid memories of reading his stories, and not just of reading them, but the impact that they had on me at the time. And I remember reading The Snow Queen at the age of around 7, with a sort of torch under the duvet of my bed, and imagining that my bed was turning into Lapland, and I was riding out across those snowy plains to the palace of the Snow Queen. So I still sort of remember how those stories sort of bled themselves into my head, into my imagination, or oozed into me. So I wanted to sort of delve into his life somehow and sort of find out a bit about it, but also because I think he really did raise himself out from a very inauspicious beginning. You know, the son of a local washerwoman, and his grandfather, I think, was in the local the sort of local asylum. His one of his aunts ran a brothel, who was probably the best, you know, most successful of his relatives. So he had this sort of rather difficult beginning in life, but he had this tremendous talent and this tremendous determination, and he was really, really good at kowtowing to the great and good of Danish society. He would doff his cap to anybody if it might help him to get on, and it did. And eventually he, as he put it in his autobiography, you know, he ended up drinking his chocolate with the Queen of Denmark, and sitting with at dinner with the Archduke of Bavaria. And there's a very oily bit in one of his memoirs. He wrote quite a few memoirs because he loved telling people about the fairy tale of my life, as he used to call it. And he talks about going to, I think it's the Prince of the Duke of Bavaria, Prince of Bavaria, I think, telling him how his wife had insisted on hearing the story of the steadfast tin soldier whilst she was about to give birth to their child. Wow. So there you go. What an accolade. And he hung out with people like Charles Dickens and Alexander Dumas. I think took him through into the saltier areas of the Parisian theatre. Various sort of literary figures of the time gave him their hospitality, and he recorded them all in these sort of wonderfully extravagant memoirs, sort of bragging about how he had lifted himself out from the gutter to this sort of great position. But at the same time, you know, he did very well out of his books. They were very successful at the time. He wasn't he wasn't lavishly wealthy. You know, he still lived in, I think, rented accommodation, and had quite a, you know, fairly Spartan existence right to the end of his days. But he did change fairy tales. And I think also that, I suppose possibly the main reason why I chose to write about him was because I think that Hans Christian Andersen represents a sort of end point of a certain history of the fairy tale. You know, other people can obviously tell that story differently, but I felt that when you get to Hans Christian Andersen, you're reaching the point at which children's literature is taking over, and the traditional fairy tale is reaching its end point. And he was somebody who listened to fairy tales as a child that were told around the spinning wheel when he was accompanying his grandmother in the local sort of Poor Law Institute, helping out in the garden where his grandfather was an inmate. And he would listen to the women telling stories. And he talks in his memoirs about sort of seeing sort of mad women coming out of the cells, and from one room, and then listening to the women telling old folk tales in another. And those stories influenced him, especially with some of the earlier fairy tales that he published. And then gradually over time, he developed his own original fairy tales. And of course, all fairy tales are originating from, there's a path that they've all gone down through many generations and centuries. But I think with Hans Christian Andersen, you're reaching as original as a fairy tale can be in some cases. Not necessarily in all of them, but I think with something like the Snow Queen, for example, you've got a lot of originality to the way that the story is told, but it has a lot of parallels with stories like Asbjørnsen and Moe and Norway had collected the story of east of the sun, west of the moon, and some of those sort of traveling quest narratives that seem to have influenced Andersen. The Little Mermaid seems to have a lot of there are a lot of variations that you could go back in time to sort of to say that's the path that story has gone down before Andersen has told it. There's a story called I think it's called The Travelling Companion, which has parallels with the story that I just mentioned from the Indian collection, or the Kashmiri collection, the Golden City. So there's all kinds of influences, and many stories that are influenced by the 1001 Nights. But I think in some stories like The Steadfast Tin Soldier, you are looking at stories where Andersen was looking at the world around him and the world of the nursery that children of his time were being sort of raised in. And it was giving them stories that reflected that world. And so the fairy tales that they would be read to, that would be read to them, would have those details of their world. They weren't just old world stories, which was what fairy tales always had been. They were stories that had actually become contemporary. So they had tin soldiers in them, for example. And I think that's something that's sort of interesting and new, and paves the way for a lot of the children's literature that was following, where it is trying to get closer to the world of its audience.
I can completely understand your love of the Snow Queen, because it is one of my favorites as well. And when I was a small child, my sister had a book called Favorite Fairy Tales that had 4 stories in it, and the one was Snow Queen, and it had drawings in it that I just loved. It was published in 1966. One of the stories in it of the Swan Princess was illustrated by Raymond Briggs, and it was one of his first jobs, the guy that did the Snowman and Father Christmas and all that. And so I'd been trying to find it for years, and I didn't know what it was called. And eventually I managed to remember enough stories from it, because there was Beauty and the Beast in it as well. And I ordered it online in the hope that it was the right one. And I came home one day, and I remember it's this massive, huge book. And I came home, and there's a small A5 size package. And I thought, it's not the right book. And I opened it, and it was. But it wasn't that the book was giant. It was that I was small. I was a wee boy at the time. So it seemed like a large book, but then it's an A5. But what a story, it's wonderful. We really don't have time to go into your other book, The Epic Continent, which is epic poetry and tales from Europe, from the Odyssey to Beowulf. Love to talk about that, but we don't really have time. I would like to ask, though. But check it out, folks. Epic Continent. Nicholas Jubber. Check it out. Along with the Fairy Tellers. Brilliant read. But you have another book coming out next month.
I do, yes. Yes, it's rattling forward quite fast now, yes. Yeah, it's my new book, Monsterland, which is a journey around the world's dark imagination. And this is, obviously it's got a lot of, there's an overlap of ideas in some ways with the fairy tellers, but it goes off in a somewhat different direction. It's focused very much on my journeys around monsters and looking at the sort of the historical and mythical and geographical roots behind various monsters, from the giants of Cornwall to the Bavarian dragon to the Oni, or the sort of ogres of Japan, all the way through. There's a chapter about the Selkies of Orkney, which was how we met, a little while back when I was.
Because you knew that monsters could tell stories.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You came to meet me.
Exactly. So I thought I'd better meet Tom. And I was, and also I wanted a little bit of shelter after camping in various places on Sandy and elsewhere, getting quite a lot of rain on me, and learning various Orcadian terms for rain. I remember thinking it was very meaningful that you have so many words for rain. So but yeah, the Selkie stories, and obviously there's a question there: what is a monster? So I think a Selkie is on a very different part of the spectrum of monsters from what something like a dragon or an ogre, or at least as we see it. But there's much to be discussed there. But it's a book about, in many ways, it's a book about community, and it's about how, I guess one of the questions I wanted to resolve was that we have these ideas of these terrifying creatures out there, that we're supposed to be sort of scared of and sort of to hate and to want to get them away from us. But we always gather around them. When we tell stories, we so often want stories of monsters, right from people sitting around the half place listening to stories, storytelling, even storytelling events today, still monsters often feature very much in them, through to Hollywood movies. But also the community gatherings. Monsters are often a great sort of focal point of community identity. One of the chapters in my book is about the dragon in Fürstenwald in Bavaria, in Germany, where every year, this has been going on since the 16th century at least, it's probably much earlier than that. Every year people will gather in thousands to parade in medieval dress or to watch people parading medieval dress, and to see a dragon processing around the streets. And then there's a big performance of the dragon, and the dragon being slain by the hero. And there's particular members of the community who are selected as the knight Udo, who's a sort of variation of St. George, and as the princess, or Lady Maria. And it's a huge communal gathering, and that is a very meaningful thing for the region there. And there are variations of that, I think, all over the world. And that's something that I was fascinated to discover, really, in places like in Louisiana, where they have a festival about the Rougarou Fest, which is a sort of local werewolf legend in the USA, or in Japan, where you have, one of the richest ranges of monsters that I think anywhere in the world can boast, with so many, the yokai, the various different kinds of creatures, and amongst them the Oni, which I focused on there, where there are sort of temple rituals connected with the springtime and that sort of seasonal resonance that a lot of monsters have, because I think they go back so much to how societies related to nature and to the wild, and in some ways to our sort of demonization, literally, of the wild places and of nature. But I think that's evolved over the ages. In some ways it hasn't, in some ways it has. And through that you can sort of track human history, I think, through our relationship with monsters, and through the stories of monsters that we've told, and the way that those stories have changed, and the ways that in many ways the stories have stayed the same, and which is why so many of those ancient stories continue to resonate.
Wonderful. Can't wait to get a copy when that comes out. And I mean, you've also done many travel books as well, from Afghanistan, Iran, and in North Africa as well. Sahara, traveling across the Sahara with nomads. I mean, my God, you've had some life.
Oh,
No. But people, check out Nicholas Jubber, Jubber, and the fairy teller. Highly recommend. Epic Continent, wonderful. The Monsterland, coming out in April. Brilliant things. You'll love to sit down, read those, and have those on your bookshelves and treasure them, because they are a literary treasure. Nick, thank you so much for joining us and giving so much of your time. It's been an absolute pleasure and an incredible education. I owe you a great debt, my friend.
Oh no, thank you, Tom. That's really kind of you. It's always a pleasure to blather away with you, and lovely to have this chat with you.
Next time you're in Orkney, come by, and you can have, I will cook you a meal and pour drams.
Oh, I look forward to it.
There's a bed upstairs, so don't worry about having to camp in the rain.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Nick Jubber, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.